The title of this video is definitely not clickbait. The ViewSonic Elite XG341C-2K is arguably the worst gaming monitor I have ever reviewed, and that's coming from someone who's tested 200 different panels. It's quite a shame because when you look at its specs, it's actually pretty tasty. It's got a 34-inch ultra-wide 1440p resolution that runs up to 200Hz refresh rate. It's also got full array local dimming with a whopping display HDR1400 certification, has got AMD FreeSync technology as well, and those fabled HDMI 2.1 ports. Now its price is a little bit off-putting at £1,500 in the UK and $1,500 in the US, but that's going to be the least of your worries. Now to kick off this independent review, I do want to quickly touch upon its inputs. It's got a singular DisplayPort 1.4 input with DSC and also two HDMI 2.1 inputs, all of which had no issues in terms of outputting the ultra-wide 1440p format at up to 200Hz. Better still, I was able to select between 8 and 12 bits depending on the inputs that I was selecting. Now elsewhere you do also have a USB Type-C input, which is very handy because it also delivers 90 watts of power, and that will certainly be of interest for laptop users. Now with its inputs out of the way, let's dig into its refresh rate. See here, the manufacturer claims it'll run up to 200Hz, and while it technically does, it suffers from frame skipping. You can clearly see this via the test via Blurbusters, which is a very handy tool and you can use it yourself if you so wish. Now this means that you're going to get a dampened experience. Now further emphasizing the point, at 200Hz, if for some odd reason you want to run it, you will be disappointed to learn that it effectively disables NVIDIA G-Sync and or AMD FreeSync, local dimming, and also pure XP, which is blur reduction. Frankly, here you're getting a dampened experience and locking yourself out of a multitude of options, which just doesn't make any sense. Furthermore, I'd be hard pressed for anyone to tell me that they can really see a difference between 165Hz and 200Hz. So with that in mind, I set the monitor to 165Hz and started by testing. Now first off, objectively, I was extremely impressed to see how this monitor's input lag performed. See, I had it tested at 2.7 milliseconds, and while it's not exactly the lowest that I've tested to date, it's among one of the fastest out there specifically for an ultra-wide monitor. Now subjectively, as someone who shoved over 2,500 hours on competitive Counter-Strike, I was certainly impressed as well. My mouse clicks were very much responding exactly as I would expect them to, and it just left me actually pretty jaw-dropped for this ultra-wide gaming monitor to be responding so quickly to my inputs. However, that's where the fun kind of stopped. See, its input lag was seriously impressive, but the same couldn't be said about its response time. Now here I had it objectively tested in the different overdrive modes via the OSRTT tool. Now its standard mode preset, it noted 9.66 milliseconds, which you can see at the bottom left hand side of your screen, noted as average initial time. Moving over to the fast mode preset, it dropped to 8.71 milliseconds. Going to the faster mode preset, 8.18 milliseconds. Going on to ultra fast, 7.17 milliseconds, and going on to the fastest mode preset, 6.42 milliseconds. Now indeed, the monitor's response time was actually pretty disappointing, specifically for a modern panel that also cost a pretty penny. Furthermore, the amount of inverse ghosting that I induced on terms of the fastest and ultra fast mode presets was pretty unacceptable, be it on playing a potato looking game like Counter-Strike or indeed playing a more graphically intense game such as Destiny 2. So much so that I had to dial it down to its medium setting, which is faster, and therefore was tested with an average initial time of 8.18 milliseconds. Now while its faster mode overdrives do induce a little bit of inverse ghosting, what was actually even worse was the amount of blurriness and also smearing. Given this has a curved VA panel, it's almost no surprise, but I wasn't expecting said monitor to have such a degree of problem. Now via the UFO ghosting test, you can see how the UFO really trails behind, and indeed over here it's very much noticeable in the real world. Even while using the pure XP setting, which effectively is blur reduction mode, you can still see the amount of trailing that is occurring behind the UFO, which given the price point of this monitor is absolutely unacceptable. Now I should have a quick word on the pure XP option, which does indeed try and reduce the blur, but as I did mention before, has got a pretty horrid experience. Furthermore, it does actually lock the overdrive mode to the highest, and therefore means that you can notice quite a bit of inverse ghosting. I think most people will not be able to use this monitor in the pure XP option, purely because the overdrive mode is ridiculous, and therefore means that you're just going to get a horrible visual experience. Now I should also emphasize that this is only available over 75 Hz. A small little point worth making if you're running this monitor for a console, and therefore if you're capped at 60 Hz, you will not have access to the pure XP option. Now on the subject of console gaming, I should also mention that this monitor will run 1440p in an ultrawide or non-ultrawide format at 120 Hz, and also full HD at 120 Hz. Better still, it also accepts a 4K signal input, and therefore via my 4K Blu-ray player that was connected over HDMI, I was able to output 4K at 60 Hz. Now so far the monitor's performance is rather lackluster, but unfortunately its woes do not stop. See, here it has AMD FreeSync technology, which isn't bad, although it would have been even better to have a native G-Sync module built in, specifically the price point that it comes in at. Why is that? Because it would have had the full VRR range from 1 to 200 Hz, or of course 165 Hz if you don't want any sort of frame skipping issues. Alas, over here it's limited from 48 Hz up to 200 Hz instead. But that's not actually my main complaint. See here, Adam from PC Monitors and myself both noticed some VRR flickering, and it was very much present on the NVIDIA Pendulum demo. It might be hard to replicate over video and on YouTube, but I can safely say with my own eyes I did notice it, and therefore took away from my overall experience while using said technologies. Now you might be thinking it's all very much doom and gloom, but thankfully HDR does come to the rescue, at least to a certain degree. See here it has a display HDR1400 certification, thus meaning it should reach 1400 nits, and I can safely say that from my own test, at least in certain test windows, it did actually reach that peak brightness. Now aside from this, it does also have full array local dimming with 1152 zones, and this means when you're playing an HDR game and indeed having the local dimming enabled, you're going to get an absolutely sublime experience. Better still, due to the fact that this monitor is a 34-inch ultrawide with a 1500R curvature running 1440p, it means the overall immersion that you're attaining is absolutely incredible. Better still, the local dimming is present on both SDR and HDR. You've got different modes that you can select from. And furthermore, it doesn't suffer from any sort of haloing, at least not something that really threw me off when I was playing a game, because here some other monitors that have a mini LED structure, or indeed maybe do not have it, do suffer from haloing, and this can therefore hamper the overall gaming or indeed viewing experience, but thankfully that was not the case with this ViewSonic monitor. However, it's not all rosy. See, if you were to discard HDR altogether and have it disabled, if you want to run AMD FreeSync or NVIDIA G-Sync independently, well, unfortunately, you're going to be locked in terms of brightness. Yep, you're going to have a locked brightness with VRR technologies enabled, which is a first for me when it comes to reviewing a monitor. See here, with local dimming enabled, it's going to lock it to a whopping 650 nits or thereabouts, and if you were to disable local dimming, around 450 nits, which I appreciate for some people, it's absolutely too bright to say the least. Now of course with HDR, this sort of locking brightness is perfectly acceptable because HDR is going to regulate the brightness and therefore give you a lifelike experience, but with AMD FreeSync and NVIDIA G-Sync, that's certainly not how it should operate, so potentially ViewSonic can address this via future firmware update. Now further emphasizing the point, if you were to enable AMD FreeSync or disable it, you'll quickly note that HDR gets automatically enabled via the OSD. Very odd behavior to say the least, and it might explain why the brightness is locked in said mode. Now with that aside, I should also mention it was quite a faff enabling HDR. See here, when a monitor sees an HDR signal, it will automatically trigger HDR on terms of the OSD, and therefore should be smart enough to say, hey, there's an HDR signal, let me turn it on for the user so they don't have to faff around with the OSD. But no, ViewSonic thought, no, you have to enable HDR manually via your game settings or indeed Windows, and then you'll have to go onto the monitor's OSD in order to enable it there as well. Or of course you can have a shortcut and enable AMD FreeSync and NVIDIA G-Sync, but it just seems rather silly and pointless. Why is HDR not automatically triggered when an HDR signal is detected via the monitor? Is beyond me. So with the monitor's baffling decisions out of the way, you might think it's stopping over here, but unfortunately it doesn't, because a dedicated sRGB emulation mode or a gamut clamp is not present, which is rather odd given the fact that this monitor might be appealing to some image editors or video graders alike. Alas, over here there is no said mode, and as a result, via the native mode preset, I had the colors tested. Now via my calibrators, I noticed a gamut coverage of 99.7% sRGB and 152.3% in terms of gamut volume. And while it does seem pretty tempting in terms of its Adobe RGB and DCI-P3 performances, in terms of the actual color accuracy in both of these modes, it was actually pretty off. Now above here you can see in terms of the sRGB standard, it has an average delta of 3.69 and rather disappointingly high of 7.24. Now when it comes to its tested contrast ratio, its VA panel did excel at 3271 to 1, and while its measured white point was very impressive at 6638 Kelvin at 100%, its gamma curve was slightly off the 2.2 standard, which was slightly disheartening. Now I appreciate not everyone is an image editor nor cares about the utmost color accuracy, and in this respect if you're just a regular consumer or a gamer, you'll actually appreciate the wide color gamut of this monitor. Furthermore, it doesn't suffer from any sort of clouding, at least not from what I noticed, nor any sort of clipping around the edges of an ultra-wide format, which is sometimes a problem with some of the older monitors that I've reviewed. Now what will be of concern to all users is the overall brightness levels, and here I had it tested with local dimming and HDR at 1400 nits, which is certainly impressive. It does get all the way down to 65 nits as well, and furthermore, given that the local dimming option is enabled in SDR as well, it means that you'll have two different brightness levels, at least in terms of the peak brightness levels that you can attain. It is also worth noting that the pure XP option, which is of course the blur reduction mode just as a reminder, does have said brightness levels in the different level modes that you might select. Now this does perfectly bring me onto brightness uniformity, and here across the board I was actually left pretty impressed given the 34-inch ultra-wide format. But better still, its backlight bleed was very good. At least for a curved VA panel, there was minimal amounts of it. Better still, the images that you can see right now are with local dimming disabled. If I were to enable it, it would go completely pitch black and further bolstering the overall experience. Do bear in mind what I did mention in the HDR segment of this review, whereby the haloing is kept down to a minimum and the fact that local dimming can be enabled on both SDR and HDR. Now moving past the monitor's panel performance, let's talk about the other features. And here the OSD is a little bit counterintuitive, purely because when the joystick button is pressed, it will switch on or off the monitor, which is quite odd. Here instead it would have been great if it was accessing the OSD by pressing it down. Instead you've got a little bit of a counterintuitive use, which is quite a shame given that the fact that the monitor's OSD is actually really comprehensive and provides you a plethora of options. Now moving swiftly on, the monitor has got two 5-watt speakers, which will suffice, although I definitely suggest plugging in a headphone via the 3.5mm jack, or indeed having a set of bookshelf speakers, or indeed a DAC. Now aside from that, I should talk about the overall build quality and design, and here you've got a 3-side borderless finish with that 1500R curvature and of course the 34-inch ultra-wide format. The stand itself does hold the monitor very well and does provide height, tilt and pivot adjustment. Of course, given its size, it can't be fully rotated. Now the monitor's stand is very sturdy, but it's absolutely humongous. It doesn't fit on my IKEA Freddy desk riser, and as a result I do suspect a lot of people will have a hard time actually fitting it on their setups. Nonetheless, if you do not want this stand, you can replace it via a 100x100 VESA compatible stand. Now if you are to keep the stand, you will be pleased to know that there's this handy little phone holder that can be found at the bottom of it. Something I haven't seen before, but one that is certainly appreciated. Elsewhere, you have got a headphone hook that does prop up towards the side of the monitor. You have also got built-in mouse anchors found towards the bottom, and also some fancy Elite RGB lights, which aren't exactly bright enough, but of course if you do want to entertain your wall, then you can always do that. Now while some of these features might seem a little bit gimmicky, the built-in KVM switch is certainly appreciated. If, for example, you've got a desktop computer and you've plugged in the USB Type-B port, and then you've got, let's say, a laptop that's connected over USB Type-C, you'll be able to plug in your peripherals, such as your mouse and keyboard, directly into the monitor. Why is this beneficial? Well, it means that you can switch between the sources and still use your peripherals rather than having to unplug them and replug them into said devices. So with all that in mind, it brings me on to my verdict, and as I did mention at the beginning of this video, it's the worst monitor I've reviewed to date, and that's coming from someone who's tested 200 different panels. See, here I feel that ViewSonic should pull the product altogether from the market because it's a detriment to the brand, which otherwise makes some really impressive gaming panels. But this one isn't it. It suffers from frame skipping at 200Hz. It's got a lot of smearing, and also a lot of overshoot on most of the overdrive modes, therefore rendering the blur reduction pure XP mode completely useless. Just to add to that, it's got really poor response time across the board as well. Then the VR technologies suffer from flickering and also limit you at the peak brightness level, which doesn't make any sense. Then the HDR is not automatically triggered via the monitor's OSD, which by the way is quite frustrating to access because if you press the button, it switches it off altogether. Then just to add to that, it's got an elongated stand which doesn't make any sense, and also a £1,500 and $1,500 asking price. Now it's not all doom and gloom because it does have some competencies. Its HDR experience is really impressive, input lag is pretty low, the colours pop, at least for gamers, and it's also got certain features such as, let's say, the KVM. But unfortunately these competencies are not good enough in order to cater and or indeed carry the rest of the problems that this monitor has. Now I'd be intrigued to know what you make of this monitor down in the comment section below. If you've liked this independent detailed review, definitely do consider dropping a like, subscribing and hitting that bell notification, all of which are greatly appreciated and allows me to continue delivering honest reviews like this one. As such, I've been Totally Dubbed and I hopefully won't be killed off of ViewSonic in the near future. Take care of yourselves and goodbye.